Everyone leaves because of us.
A 9-year-old girl spoke those words in a storage room where no one could hear her cry. 12 tutors had walked away in 1 year, each one convinced these children were impossible to reach. But when an old janitor with a haunted past sat beside her in the darkness, something shifted, and the tower's most powerful people would soon discover that the man they called dangerous might be the only one who could see the truth hidden behind those frozen, silent faces. Welcome to Golden Heart Stories. This is the story of an old janitor who carried a past no one understood, and the 2 silent children who finally found someone who could see them. The afternoon sun cut through the floor to ceiling windows of Harborline Tower's executive suite, casting harsh rectangular shadows across the polished marble floor. On the 98th floor, where the air itself seemed thinner and more expensive, 9-year-old twins Hannah and Chloe Sterling stood side by side near the grand piano. Their matching navy uniforms, perfectly pressed, their expressions perfectly blank. The newest tutor, a stern woman with wire-rimmed glasses and 20 years of prestigious academy experience, stood trembling by the door, her leather portfolio clutched against her chest like a shield. Papers were scattered across the carpet behind her, textbooks lay spine cracked and abandoned near the sofa, and overturned water glass had left a dark stain spreading slowly across the silk cushion. The tutor's lips moved, but no words came out, only a strangled sound of frustration and defeat. Before she turned and fled toward the elevator without looking back, the heavy oak door slammed shut, and the echo seemed to hang in the air for several long seconds, mixing with the low hum of the air conditioning and the distant whisper of city traffic far below. In her corner office behind walls of frosted glass, CEO Veronica Sterling sat motionless at her obsidian desk, her fingers pressed against her temples, her designer blazer rumpled in a way that would have shocked the board members who saw only her polished exterior. The intercom buzzed once, twice, 3 times before she finally lifted her head. Her assistant's voice crackled through, hesitant and apologetic, announcing the tutor's immediate resignation. Veronica's jaw tightened, and something behind her eyes seemed to crack open just slightly, releasing a wave of exhaustion and grief that she had been holding back for months. She rose from her chair with mechanical precision, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood as she crossed into the main living area, where her daughters waited in their usual silence. When she spoke, her voice came out louder than she intended, edged with a rawness that made both girls flinch. Do you understand what you've done? That was the 12th tutor this year. 12 educated professionals who could not handle 2 children. The words fell like stones into still water. Hannah's small shoulders curled inward slightly, but neither twin answered. Veronica pressed her palm against her forehead, struggling to contain emotions she could not name, pressures she could not release. Outside her office door, in the corridor, where the carpeting muffled every footstep, employees clustered in small groups, their voices low and careful. A young analyst whispered to his colleague that the Sterling twins were impossible, that no amount of money could convince anyone to stay in that position. An administrative assistant nodded knowingly, mentioning the revolving door of nannies, tutors, and caregivers who had all walked away shaking their heads. Someone else murmured about the late Mr. Sterling, about tragedy and trauma, about children who had frozen into themselves and could no longer be reached. At the far end of the hallway, partially hidden behind a housekeeping cart loaded with cleaning supplies and fresh linens, 68-year-old Arthur Hale stood perfectly still. His weathered hands rested on the handle of his mop, his gray janitorial uniform worn soft from years of washing, his posture bent slightly from decades of invisible labor. But his eyes, pale blue and deeply creased at the corners, were alert and watchful. He had been cleaning these floors for 3 years, moving through the tower's levels like a ghost, unnoticed and unremarked upon by those who passed him daily. Yet Arthur noticed everything. He saw the way Hannah's left hand trembled when her mother's voice rose. He saw the way Chloe positioned herself, half a step in front of her sister, protective and wary. He saw the tightness in Veronica's expression, the battle between anger and sorrow that played out across her face. And he saw what no one else seemed to see, that these were not problem children, but children drowning in problems, far too large for their small frames to carry. Arthur said nothing, made no move to interfere or comment. He simply observed, his weathered face impassive, his presence as quiet and steady as the slow turning of the earth beneath the tower's steel foundations. The employees dispersed gradually, returning to their desks and their duties, already forgetting the scene they had just witnessed. But Arthur remained a moment longer, his gaze lingering on the closed door of the executive suite, on the silence that pressed against it from within. The alarm clock rattled at 5:15 in the morning, its tinny mechanical sound cutting through the darkness of Arthur Hale's rented room on the third floor of a narrow building in the old district. He woke immediately, as he had for decades, his body trained by years of early shifts and long hours. The room was barely large enough for a single bed, a wooden chair, and a small table pushed against the wall beneath a window that looked out onto a brick alley. Arthur sat up slowly, his joints protesting the movement, and reached over to silence the clock with practiced precision. In the gray pre-dawn light filtering through the thin curtain, every object in the room seemed weighted with age and memory. He rose and shuffled to the table, where an old transistor radio sat beside a chipped porcelain mug. He switched it on with a gentle click, and static filled the air before resolving into the low murmur of the morning news program. The radio was at least 40 years old, its wood veneer cracked and faded, its dial loose from countless adjustments. Arthur had never replaced it, just as he had never replaced the mug or the threadbare blanket folded at the foot of his bed. These things had been with him through too much to discard now. Beside the radio, in a simple brass frame that had long since lost its shine, sat a photograph of a woman with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in a soft bun. Margaret Hale had died 10 years ago, her passing quiet and sudden, leaving Arthur in a silence that had never quite lifted. He touched the edge of the frame lightly, his fingertips tracing the worn wood as he did every morning, a ritual of remembrance that required no words. Margaret had been a school librarian, patient and gentle, and Arthur had loved her with a steady devotion that had shaped his entire life. Even now, he sometimes turned to speak to her before remembering she was gone. Arthur moved through his morning routine with mechanical efficiency, washing his face in the shared bathroom down the hall, heating water for instant coffee that tasted of nothing but necessity. As he dressed in his gray uniform, his mind drifted back to the years before Harborline Tower. Before Margaret's death, before everything had narrowed to this small room. For 30 years, Arthur had worked as a custodian at Riverside Elementary School. A position that most people barely noticed but that had given him quiet satisfaction. He had known hundreds of children over those decades, watched them grow and struggle and succeed. The teachers had respected him, the principal had relied on him, and the children had trusted him. Arthur had taken pride in keeping the school clean and safe, in being someone the community could depend on. But that chapter of his life had ended abruptly, not with retirement or celebration, but with smoke and flames and the sound of a child screaming. The memory rose unbidden, as it did most mornings, sharp and vivid despite the years that had passed. There had been a fire at the school. An electrical malfunction in the old building's wiring that had sparked during the night and spread faster than anyone anticipated. Arthur had been there early, as always, and he had heard the cry for help from a child who had returned to retrieve a forgotten backpack. He had run toward the sound without hesitation, plunging into smoke that burned his lungs and heat that seared his skin. But he had not been fast enough, had not been strong enough. Had not been able to reach the child before the ceiling collapsed and the firefighters pulled him back. The child had survived, rescued by others, but Arthur had carried the weight of that failure ever since. Rumors had spread in the aftermath, distorted and incomplete, whispers about the custodian. And the fire, about what he had done or failed to do, about why he had left the school shortly after. The truth was far simpler and far more painful. Arthur had stayed as long as he could bear. But every hallway and classroom had become a reminder of the moment when his strength had not been enough. He finished his coffee in silence, rinsed the mug, and placed it back on the table. The radio continued its soft commentary on weather and traffic. Arthur looked once more at Margaret's photograph, his expression unreadable, then turned and left the room, locking the door behind him. The day was beginning, and he had work to do, floors to clean and duties to fulfill in a tower where no one knew his name or his history. It was, he thought as he descended the narrow stairs, perhaps the only mercy left to him. The executive suite felt colder than usual that evening. Veronica Sterling stood in the center of the living area, her arms crossed tightly, her posture rigid with frustration that had been building for months. Hannah and Chloe sat on the edge of the leather sofa, their hands folded identically in their laps, their backs straight as if braced for impact. The silence stretched taut as a wire. Veronica's voice, when it finally came, cut through like a blade. Your father would be ashamed of this behavior. He worked so hard to build this company, to give you every advantage, every opportunity. And this is how you repay his memory? By driving away every person who tries to help you. The words hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Hannah's face remained perfectly still, her expression blank as a doll's. But her left shoulder gave a small, involuntary tremor that rippled through her thin frame like a fault line shifting beneath the surface. It was subtle, barely perceptible, the kind of movement that might have been dismissed as nothing more than a passing chill. But it spoke of something deeper, something breaking apart inside where no one could see. Chloe's hand moved almost imperceptibly closer to her sister's, not quite touching but offering proximity as the only comfort available. Neither girl spoke. Neither girl looked up. They had learned long ago that silence was safer than words, that stillness was a form of protection against the unpredictable storms of adult emotion. Veronica pressed her fingertips against her temples, her eyes closing briefly as she fought to control the tide of emotion threatening to overwhelm her. She had not meant to invoke her late husband, had not meant to weaponize his memory, but the words had escaped before she could stop them. She opened her mouth to soften the blow, to explain, but found herself unable to form the sentences. The distance between them felt insurmountable. Veronica turned away abruptly, her heels clicking as she retreated to her office, leaving the twins alone in the vast, silent room. In the corridors beyond, the building's staff moved through their evening duties, their conversations carrying judgment and resignation. A security guard mentioned that the Sterling twins were impossible to manage, that privilege had spoiled them beyond redemption. An office manager shook her head knowingly, commenting that some children were simply born difficult. A young intern whispered that she felt sorry for anyone assigned to work with those girls. The consensus was clear: Hannah and Chloe Sterling were problem children, lost causes, and the kindest thing anyone could do was stay out of their way. Arthur Hale heard these conversations as he moved through the hallways with his cleaning cart, emptying waste bins and wiping down surfaces that already gleamed under the fluorescent lights. He said nothing, offered no opinion, gave no sign that he was listening at all. But he was, and unlike the others, Arthur had seen what they had missed. He had been in the corridor outside the executive suite when Veronica spoke, had been close enough to hear the mention of the girl's father. Had been positioned at an angle that allowed him to see through the partially open door. He had watched Hannah's shoulder tremble at those words, had seen the way her small body seemed to fold inward. Just slightly, as if trying to make itself smaller, less visible, less vulnerable to further wounds. The other staff members saw defiance and dysfunction. Arthur saw something entirely different. He saw two children who had been frozen by trauma, locked in a protective stillness that everyone mistook for coldness or rebellion. He saw the wound hidden beneath their silence, deep and unhealed, growing more painful with every adult who failed to understand. Arthur continued his work methodically, moving from floor to floor with quiet persistence. But his mind lingered on that trembling shoulder, on the way Hannah had flinched at the sound of her father's name. He recognized that response, had seen it before in other children who carried grief too large for their small frames. The world saw problem children. Arthur saw children with problems, and the difference between those two perspectives was vast and critical. As he pushed his cart toward the service elevator, his weathered face remained impassive, but behind his pale blue eyes something had shifted. These girls needed someone who could see them clearly, who could sit with their pain without trying to fix it. Arthur did not know if he was that person. But he knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that he could not simply walk past their suffering without acknowledgement. The fluorescent lights in the basement corridors of Harborline Tower flickered intermittently, casting uneven shadows across concrete walls and linoleum floors. Arthur Hale pushed his cleaning cart through the narrow passageways, the wheels squeaking softly, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The basement level housed storage rooms and archives that few people visited, making it one of the quieter areas. Arthur preferred these forgotten spaces, where he could work in peace. As he approached storage room 15C, filled with outdated furniture and filing boxes, he heard a sound that made him pause, the soft, stifled sound of someone crying. Arthur set down his cart carefully, making no noise. He moved to the doorway and peered into the dimly lit room, where dust motes drifted through the air like suspended ghosts. Behind a stack of cardboard boxes, partially hidden by an old desk turned on its side, Hannah Sterling sat curled against the wall with her knees drawn to her chest and her face buried in her folded arms. Her small body shook with silent sobs, her shoulders rising and falling with grief held back too long. She had not heard Arthur approach, or perhaps she no longer cared who might find her. The sight of her there, alone and broken in that dusty forgotten room, struck something deep within Arthur's chest. A pain that resonated with his own memories of isolation and unwitnessed suffering. He did not call out to her or ask what was wrong. He did not offer empty reassurances or demand explanations. Instead, Arthur simply stepped into the room and lowered himself carefully onto an overturned crate a few feet away from where Hannah sat, positioning himself close enough to be present but far enough to give her space. He settled there in silence, his weathered hands resting on his knees, his gaze directed toward the far wall rather than at the crying child. Minutes passed, measured only by the steady rhythm of breathing and the occasional catch in Hannah's throat as she struggled to control her tears. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, her sobs began to quiet, not because the pain had lessened but because she had become aware of the quiet presence beside her. Someone who was not demanding that she stop or explain or pretend to be fine. Hannah lifted her head slowly, her tear-streaked face turning toward Arthur with an expression of confusion and wariness. She recognized him vaguely as the old custodian who moved through the building like a shadow, someone the adults barely noticed and never spoke to. Her voice, when it finally emerged, was small and raw and trembling with emotions she had never been allowed to express. People say everyone leaves because of us. The tutors, the nannies, everyone. They say we're the problem. They say we make things impossible. The words hung in the dusty air between them, a confession and an accusation and a plea for someone to tell her it was not true. Arthur remained still for a long moment, his eyes finally moving to meet hers. His face showed something she had not seen in any adult's expression before, not pity, not judgment. Not the desperate urge to fix what was broken, but rather a deep recognition of pain that matched her own. His eyes, pale blue and lined with years of accumulated sorrow, carried their own unspoken grief, their own history of loss and failure and unbearable weight. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and rough, as if he had not used it much in recent years. Sometimes people leave because they don't know how to stay. Not because you've done anything wrong. Hannah stared at him, her small hands gripping the fabric of her uniform skirt, her breath still catching in uneven intervals. Arthur looked away again, his gaze distant, seeing not the storage room but some other place and time that still haunted him. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and the fingers resting on his knees curled slightly inward, as if bracing against a memory too painful to confront. He did not elaborate, did not explain the source of the old pain visible in every line of his face. But Hannah, with the intuitive understanding that children sometimes possess, sensed that this quiet old man carried his own version of the grief she felt. They sat together in that forgotten room, two people separated by decades but united in their shared experience of loss. As the dust continued to drift slowly through the stale air and the building above carried on, unaware of the small moment of recognition occurring in its depths. The security office on the 42nd floor was a windowless room lined with monitors displaying grainy feeds from cameras throughout the building. Arthur Hale stood in the center, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, his posture neither defensive nor defiant but simply still, as if he had learned long ago that stillness was the safest response to scrutiny. Two security guards flanked the desk where Head of Security Michael Brennan sat reviewing footage on a tablet. His expression stern and professionally skeptical. The footage showed Arthur entering storage room 15C the previous evening, remaining inside for approximately 20 minutes, then emerging with Hannah Sterling walking quietly beside him. To anyone watching without context, it looked innocent enough. But context, Arthur knew, was everything, and context could be shaped by suspicion into something far more sinister than the truth. Brennan looked up from the screen, his eyes narrowing as he studied Arthur's weathered face. The older guard, Patterson, shifted uncomfortably. The younger guard, Stevens, maintained a rigid stance. The atmosphere in the room was thick with unspoken accusation, the kind of tension that preceded judgment already rendered in private minds. Brennan's voice carried the measured tone of someone performing an unpleasant duty. "Mr. Hale, we need to ask you about your interaction with one of the Sterling children yesterday evening. You were alone with her in a basement storage room. Can you explain what you were doing there?" Arthur met Brennan's gaze steadily, his pale blue eyes revealing nothing of the emotions churning beneath his calm exterior. He had expected this. People always asked questions when they saw things they did not understand. His voice was quiet and measured. "The child was upset. I sat with her until she felt better. That's all." Patterson, the older guard, cleared his throat uncomfortably. The younger guard, Stevens, leaned forward, his expression hardening. It was Stevens who spoke next, his words dropping like stones into still water. "I heard a child was involved in that fire. Back at your old job. That's why you left, isn't it?" The statement hung in the air, vague and damning in its imprecision. Arthur's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only outward sign of impact. He did not ask which fire Stevens meant, did not demand clarification, because he knew that explanations rarely mattered once rumors took root. The fire at Riverside Elementary had happened years ago, and the details had been obscured by time and gossip. There had been a child, yes. There had been flames and Arthur running toward danger. But the specifics of what had actually occurred, the distinction between heroism and failure, had been lost in the retelling. All that remained was the shadow of an incident. A vague association between Arthur Hale and a child and a fire, and that shadow was enough to cast doubt on everything he did. Arthur said nothing in response to Stephen's accusation. He simply stood there, his weathered face impassive, his hands still clasped before him, his silence neither admission nor denial. Brennan watched him carefully, searching for signs of guilt or innocence in the lined features of a man who had learned to keep his pain private. The truth was unclear, intentionally or otherwise distorted by time and distance. Whether Arthur had been a hero who tried and failed, or something darker that people whispered about but never stated directly, remained ambiguous. After what felt like an eternity, Brennan nodded slowly and gestured toward the door, his voice carrying a note of warning. "You can go, Mr. Hale. But I'd advise you to maintain appropriate boundaries with building residents, especially minors. We'll be monitoring the situation." Arthur turned without a word and walked toward the door, his movements deliberate despite the tension pressing against his shoulders. As he left the security office and stepped into the corridor beyond, he heard the low murmur of voices resuming behind him, discussing and speculating and adding their own interpretations to the incomplete story of his past. The door closed with a soft click. Arthur walked toward the elevator, his face revealing nothing of the turmoil within him. The old wounds reopened by careless words and the knowledge that suspicion, once planted, grew wild regardless of truth. The tension had deepened, the shadow over him growing darker, and he knew with weary certainty that this would not be the end of the questions. Or the doubt that followed him like a ghost he could never outrun. Veronica Sterling stood at the window of her corner office, her arms wrapped around herself as if warding off a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. Below, the city stretched out in geometric patterns, but she saw none of it. Her mind replayed the scene from 2 evenings ago, when she had found Hannah after the child had been missing for nearly an hour. The girl had not been hiding or sulking as expected. Instead, she had been sitting quietly at the dining table with a glass of water, her face calm in a way Veronica had not seen in months. And beside her, wiping down the counter, had been the elderly custodian whose name she had only recently learned. Arthur Hale. The old man had nodded politely when Veronica entered, then excused himself without explanation, leaving behind a daughter who seemed somehow less brittle. Veronica had questioned Hannah carefully. Hannah's answer had been simple: she had been upset, and the cleaning man had sat with her until she felt better. That simple act of presence had accomplished what 12 tutors and countless adults had failed to achieve. Over the following days, Veronica had observed more carefully. She noticed that when Arthur was working on their floor, both twins seemed to relax imperceptibly, their shoulders dropping slightly from their perpetual tension. She saw Hannah glance toward him once as he emptied a waste bin, not with fear but with something that looked like recognition. She watched Chloe's rigid posture soften marginally when Arthur passed in the corridor. It was not dramatic, this change, but Veronica had been watching her daughters closely enough to recognize even the smallest shifts. Whatever Arthur Hale was doing, or perhaps what he was not doing, it was reaching the twins in a way nothing else had managed. The decision to approach him had not been easy. Veronica knew the rumors circulating among the staff, the whispers about an incident at Arthur's previous job. The vague implications that cast shadows without solidifying into accusations. She had considered conducting a background check, hiring investigators. But something in her gut, the same instinct that had guided her through difficult business decisions, told her that who Arthur was now mattered more than the incomplete stories others told about his past. And so, on a Wednesday afternoon when the building was quiet and autumn light slanted through the windows, Veronica summoned Arthur to her office. He arrived exactly on time, his gray uniform clean but showing its age, his weathered face composed. He stood just inside the doorway, his hands clasped in front of him, neither servile nor defiant but simply present. Veronica gestured to the chair across from her desk, but Arthur remained standing, waiting with the patience of someone accustomed to being kept waiting. She abandoned formality and spoke directly, her voice carrying both authority and something more vulnerable. "Mr. Hale, I've noticed that my daughters respond differently when you're around. They're calmer, less withdrawn. I'd like to ask if you would be willing to spend time with them after your shift ends. 2 hours each day. I'll compensate you separately for this, of course." Arthur's expression did not change, but something flickered behind his pale blue eyes. A conflict between impulse and caution, between the desire to help and the weight of his own history. He looked down at his hands, then back at Veronica, his voice quiet when he finally spoke. "I don't know if I'm the right person for that, ma'am." The words carried layers of meaning, acknowledgement of the rumors perhaps, or recognition of his own limitations. Or simply the honest assessment of a man who had learned not to overestimate his capacity to fix what was broken. Veronica stood and moved around the desk, closing some of the distance between them, her corporate armor slipping slightly to reveal the exhausted mother beneath. "Today my daughters looked at someone's face for the first time in months. Really looked. Not through, not past, but at. That person was you, Mr. Hale." Her voice caught slightly on the words, emotion threatening to break through the control she maintained so carefully. Arthur met her gaze then, and in that moment, they understood each other perfectly, two people who had both lost something essential and were trying, in their different ways, to protect what remained. Arthur nodded slowly, a gesture that was neither acceptance nor refusal but rather acknowledgement of the weight she was asking him to carry. The request hung between them, fragile and significant, waiting for his answer in the fading afternoon light that filled the office with long shadows and the promise of evening. The days that followed took on a rhythm that felt almost fragile in its simplicity. As if the slightest disruption might shatter the delicate piece being constructed. Each afternoon at 4 o'clock, after Arthur completed his regular duties, he would arrive at the executive suite carrying nothing but his quiet presence and an old thermos of tea he never drank. Hannah and Chloe would be waiting in the living area, their homework spread across the low table. But largely ignored, their attention focused on the door until he appeared. The twins had learned not to expect grand gestures from Arthur. Instead, they had discovered something more valuable: consistency, patience, and the rare gift of an adult who did not need them to be anything other than what they were. On Tuesday afternoons, Arthur taught them to fold paper boats from old newspapers, his weathered hands moving slowly so they could follow each crease. The boats were never perfect, often lopsided and likely to sink immediately, but the girls approached the task with quiet concentration, their faces relaxing. On Thursdays, Arthur brought simple lunches wrapped in cloth napkins, sandwiches made with bread from the corner bakery. Nothing fancy but prepared with deliberate thoughtfulness. They ate together in comfortable silence, or sometimes with Hannah asking small questions about Arthur's life that he answered honestly but sparingly. On other days, Arthur simply sat with them while soft music played from the speakers, classical pieces that filled the space without demanding conversation, creating an atmosphere where the twins could exist without performance or defense. But beyond the walls of that quiet refuge, in the corridors and conference rooms of Harborline Tower, a different narrative was taking shape through whispered conversations and knowing glances. The rumors had intensified, gaining specificity with each retelling. People claimed to know for certain that Arthur had lost a child in that fire, though no one could say whose child or exactly when it occurred. Some versions painted him as negligent, others as unlucky, but all carried the implication that something dark haunted the old custodian's past. Security guard Stevens had become particularly vocal, mentioning to anyone who would listen that he found it suspicious how quickly Veronica Sterling had dismissed concerns about Arthur's history. Douglas Reed, a board member who had been quietly campaigning to replace Veronica as CEO for 18 months, recognized opportunity in the growing unease. Reed was 56 years old, silver-haired and expensively suited, with calculated charm that concealed ruthless ambition. He had built his career on identifying weaknesses in others and exploiting them with surgical precision. During a board meeting on a gray November afternoon, Reed raised the matter with carefully rehearsed spontaneity. "I feel compelled to mention something regarding safety protocols for Veronica's daughters. There's apparently an elderly staff member with a questionable background spending unsupervised time with the children. I'm sure it's nothing, but we need to consider the liability." Several board members exchanged glances, doubt taking root. Reed did not elaborate further, having planted exactly the suggestion he intended. After the meeting, he expressed his concerns to two executives, each time framing it as worry for the girls rather than a move against Veronica's leadership. The rumors continued to spread, gaining momentum through repetition, transforming from speculation into accepted truth. Meanwhile, in the executive suite, Arthur sat with Hannah and Chloe as they attempted to fold their paper boats, unaware that 3 floors below a meeting was taking place that would soon threaten the fragile sanctuary they had built together. The afternoon light filtered through the windows at gentle angles, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily through the air. Hannah smiled slightly when her boat actually held its shape, and Chloe reached over to adjust a fold on her sister's creation with unexpected tenderness. Arthur watched them with his weathered face expressionless but his pale blue eyes, carrying something that might have been cautious hope, or perhaps simply the recognition that peace, when it came, was always temporary and always carried the weight of knowing it could not last. The calm they shared existed in fragile balance with the storm gathering beyond their awareness. And the contrast between the gentle scene and the dangerous currents moving through the building created a tension that hummed beneath the surface of everything, waiting for the moment when it would finally break through. The anonymous complaint arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered through the company's internal reporting system with cold bureaucratic efficiency. The message was brief and carefully worded to avoid specific accusations while implying enough concern to demand action. An unnamed employee had observed inappropriate boundaries between a custodial staff member and the CEO's minor children. Veronica read the complaint 3 times, her jaw tightening with each pass, recognizing Douglas Reed's handiwork. She knew the board was watching, knew that protecting Arthur now would cost her political capital she could not afford. With heaviness that settled like stone in her chest, she called Arthur to her office and asked him, as gently as she could manage, to step back temporarily from his time with the girls. Arthur accepted the news with quiet stillness, his weathered face revealing nothing. He simply nodded once and left without protest. But Hannah and Chloe, who had been waiting for their usual afternoon together, saw him leave early and felt the absence like a physical wound. Veronica tried to explain that evening, using careful language about procedures and temporary measures. But the twins heard only that Arthur was being taken away because of them. The guilt settled over them like a familiar weight, confirming what they had always suspected, that they were the problem, the reason good things could not last. The storm arrived 3 days later, sweeping in from the coast, with intensity that turned afternoon into premature dusk and transformed rain into sheets of water battering the tower's windows with relentless force. By 5 o'clock, the wind howled through the city's steel canyons, and visibility dropped to barely a block. Veronica was in a board meeting on the 85th floor when her assistant knocked urgently, her face pale with panic. The twins were missing. They had left the executive suite 40 minutes ago, telling the housekeeper they were going to the 10th floor library. But the library staff had never seen them. Veronica felt her heart drop as she rushed from the room, Douglas Reed's knowing glance barely registering. Within minutes, building security mobilized a full search, dividing the 98 floors among teams who spread through corridors calling the girls' names. The storm raged outside, making the situation more desperate, the temperature dropping and danger escalating. Veronica moved through the building like someone in a nightmare, her professional composure shattering as fear overwhelmed everything else. She checked the executive suite 3 times, the parking garage twice, her hands shaking. Other employees joined the search, even those who had whispered about the problem children. Now motivated by basic human horror of 2 9-year-old girls lost during a storm this severe. It was Patterson, the older security guard, who thought to check the basement storage areas. Something in his memory of that earlier security review made him head to the lowest levels. He pushed open the door to storage room 15C and found them there, Hannah and Chloe huddled behind the same stack of boxes where Hannah had once cried alone. Their clothes soaked from rain, their faces streaked with tears. And beside them, his gray jacket wrapped around their shoulders, his weathered hands holding them steady, sat Arthur Hale. The old man looked up as Patterson entered, his pale blue eyes carrying no triumph, only quiet relief. Arthur had been in the basement when he heard the building-wide announcement about the missing children, had immediately understood where they would go. Had found them shivering in the storage room that had become their sanctuary. He had not left them, had simply held them and kept them warm while the storm raged outside. Patterson radioed immediately, his voice cracking as he reported that the girls were safe, that they were with Arthur Hale in storage room 15C. Within minutes, Veronica burst through the door, her heels abandoned somewhere in her desperate run down 8 flights of stairs. Her composed exterior shattered as she fell to her knees beside her daughters and pulled them into her arms with a force that spoke of every fear she had felt. Over the twins' shoulders, Veronica met Arthur's eyes, and in that moment, no words were necessary to convey the depth of her gratitude or the recognition that this man had saved more than just her daughter's physical safety. The emergency board meeting convened 2 days after the twins were found, held in the glass-walled conference room on the 92nd floor. 14 board members sat around the long mahogany table, their expressions ranging from concerned to calculating, while Veronica Sterling stood at the head wearing her most composed professional armor. Arthur Hale had been summoned to attend, an unusual breach of protocol. He stood near the door in his gray custodial uniform, his weathered face impassive, his pale blue eyes quietly alert. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and everyone understood that what happened in the next hour would determine not just Arthur's future, but also the fragile balance of power within the company's leadership. Douglas Reed did not wait for preliminaries. He rose from his seat with the confidence of someone who believed he held winning cards. His silver hair perfectly styled, his expensive suit projecting authority. His voice carried the measured tones of someone delivering painful truths rather than launching an attack. Before we discuss the recent incident, I believe we need to address judgment and due diligence. Mr. Hale has a documented history that should have disqualified him from contact with minors. There was a fire at Riverside Elementary, and a child was involved. The details have been conveniently obscured, but this man represents a liability we cannot afford. Reed's words fell like hammers, designed to paint Arthur as dangerous. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. Arthur remained perfectly still, his face showing nothing, but his hands curled slightly inward in an almost imperceptible gesture of bracing against impact. Veronica had known this moment was coming, had prepared for it with meticulous attention. But preparation could not eliminate the anger that surged through her as she listened to Reed weaponize incomplete information against a man who had shown only kindness to her daughters. She met Reed's gaze directly, her voice cutting through the tension with precision and barely controlled fury. "You're right that there was a fire at Riverside Elementary. And yes, a child was involved. What you failed to mention, Mr. Reed, is that Arthur Hale ran into that burning building trying to save that child. He failed, not because of negligence, but because the ceiling collapsed before he could reach them. Other firefighters pulled the child out through a different route. Arthur suffered smoke inhalation and burns that took months to heal. He left that job because he could no longer walk those hallways without being reminded of the moment when his courage was not enough. What has followed him is not danger, but guilt. Unwarranted, devastating guilt that he has carried for years. The silence that followed was absolute. Several board members looked down at their papers, shame visible in their expressions. Douglas Reed's face tightened, his narrative collapsing under actual facts. Before Reed could respond, the conference room door burst open with sudden force. Hannah and Chloe Sterling rushed into the room, their faces flushed from running, their school uniforms slightly disheveled. Having escaped from whoever was supervising them, they did not hesitate or show awareness of the formality they were disrupting. Instead, they ran directly to Arthur, their small bodies colliding with his legs as they wrapped their arms around him tightly, fiercely. Arthur's weathered hands came up automatically to rest on their shoulders, his composure finally cracking as his eyes glistened with unshed tears. The gesture said everything about who this man was and what he meant to these children who had trusted so few adults. Veronica watched her daughters hold onto Arthur, and something in her chest both broke and healed simultaneously. She turned back to the board, her voice steady but carrying an edge that dared anyone to challenge what came next. Effective immediately, I'm implementing comprehensive mental health and grief support programs for all employees of this company. We've allowed rumors and fear to replace compassion and truth for too long. That ends today. The board members nodded, some with genuine agreement, others with political calculation. But all understanding that the battle was over and Veronica Sterling had won. Douglas Reed sat down heavily, his ambitions temporarily thwarted, while Arthur stood with the twins still holding him, his weathered face finally showing the relief of someone who had carried a burden alone for too long and could now, perhaps, begin to set it down. 6 months had passed since the emergency board meeting, and the transformation within Harborline Tower was subtle but unmistakable. The change was not dramatic or sudden, but rather the kind of slow restoration that happens when wounds are finally acknowledged and given space to heal. Arthur Hale moved through the building's corridors with the same quiet efficiency he had always brought to his work, pushing his cleaning cart from floor to floor. But now, when employees passed him in the hallways, they nodded with genuine warmth rather than looking through him. Security guards greeted him by name, their voices carrying respect. Administrative assistants smiled when he arrived to clean their offices, sometimes pausing to ask how he was doing or to mention that their children were learning origami, inspired by stories about paper boats folded on Tuesday afternoons. The mental health and grief support programs that Veronica had implemented had created ripples throughout the company culture, opening conversations that had been suppressed and creating permission for people to acknowledge their losses without shame. Arthur had been invited to share his story during a wellness seminar, and though he had declined with characteristic quietness, the invitation itself had meant something significant. He was no longer defined by whispered rumors, but rather seen as a whole person whose past included both tragedy and courage. The weight he had carried had not disappeared entirely, but it had become lighter, more manageable, no longer something he bore in complete isolation. On a bright afternoon in late spring, when sunlight streamed through the tower's windows and the city below hummed with energy, Arthur finished his regular duties and made his way to the executive suite at 4 o'clock. Hannah and Chloe were waiting in the living area, but instead of their usual homework, they sat together with something hidden behind their backs, their faces carrying barely suppressed excitement and nervousness. When Arthur entered, they stood simultaneously and approached him with careful steps. Hannah held out a rectangular object wrapped in tissue paper decorated with hand-drawn stars and flowers, while Chloe clutched an envelope. Arthur took the package with his weathered hands, his pale blue eyes curious. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing a handmade lunchbox, its metal surface painted with meticulous care to show a simple scene of paper boats floating on a blue river beneath a golden sun. The craftsmanship was imperfect in the way children's work always is, with uneven lines and colors that bled slightly. But the love invested in every brushstroke was unmistakable. Chloe handed him the envelope with both hands. Inside, on lined paper torn from a notebook, was a letter written in Hannah's neat handwriting with additions in Chloe's messier script. The message was simple and direct, carrying a weight that no sophisticated words could match. "Thank you for sitting with us when we were sad. Thank you for not leaving even when people said you should. You are our friend. Love, Hannah and Chloe." Arthur read the letter twice, his lips pressing together as he struggled to maintain composure. But this time, he did not quite succeed. His eyes glistened with tears that gathered but did not fall, his throat working as he swallowed against the emotion rising from somewhere deep in his chest. He looked at the twins, these two small people who had been frozen by loss and were now learning to thaw, and he saw in them something that mirrored his own journey, the possibility that broken things could be made whole again even if they would never be exactly as they were before. That evening, after his shift ended and he returned to his small rented room on the third floor of the narrow building in the old district, Arthur placed the handmade lunchbox on his table beside the brass-framed photograph of Margaret. The two objects sat together in the lamplight, one representing the past he would always carry and the other representing a future he had not dared to imagine just 6 months earlier. Arthur stood looking at them for a long moment, his weathered face finally at peace, tears trailing silently down his lined cheeks as he allowed himself to feel both the loss that had defined so many years and the hope that was beginning, tentatively, to take root. Outside his window, the city continued its endless rhythm, indifferent and vast, but inside that small room something profound had shifted. Healing, Arthur understood now, came slowly, often painfully, through small acts of connection and courage that accumulated over time like water wearing away stone. But it came. Surely, if you let it, it came. If Arthur's quiet courage and the girl's healing meant something to you today, feel free to share your thoughts below. If you know someone who needs a little hope, share this video with them. And for more stories like this, consider subscribing. Thank you for watching. This has been Golden Heart Stories.